Hello, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining this webinar on sensory processing disorders and Fragile X syndrome. Whilst this webinar was designed for therapists, we welcome all families, educators, psychologists, and anyone else I may have missed who's joining us this evening. The more people who know about Fragile X, the better. My name is Liz Jewell, and I work as the Family Support Counsellor with Fragile X Association Australia. Before we begin proceedings, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and all the lands on which we are meeting today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And so to our presenter and tonight's webinar. Bev Kadish is an occupational therapist. Bev specialises in sensory integration and neurodevelopmental therapy and has more than 25 years experience. Bev's special interests include sensory processing disorders and school readiness. In tonight's webinar, Bev will be focusing on creating a sensory diet for Fragile X syndrome. Over to you, Bev.
Thanks so much, Liz, and it's just great to see everybody here tonight. There's so many therapists, educators. I saw some NDIS coordinators, and I know there's some parents out there, and I think it's really important that we all learn about these sensory diets and how best to support our individuals with Fragile X syndrome. But before I start talking about the sensory diet, I'm just going to give you a little bit more information about Fragile X. For many therapists, this may be the first individual you've met with Fragile X that you've come tonight to create the diet about. And for others, you may be familiar with the Fragile X family. It's a genetic condition. It's caused by a change or mutation of the gene on the X chromosome. And for this reason, males are more affected than females, but the females are often the carriers. It's the most common inherited cause of intellectual disability and the most common single gene cause of autism spectrum disorder. There are a range of lifelong behavioral and learning challenges, and the various physical characteristics, such as large ears, a long face, a high arched palate, soft skin, low muscle tone, very flexible joints, particularly in the fingers, the wrists, and the elbows, large feet, and for some of the males, macroorchidism, which is large testicles post-pubertally. Now, all individuals with Fragile X have some behavioral and learning challenges, and all of them have some sensory processing challenges. Unfortunately, there is no cure for Fragile X, but there are lots of therapies and interventions, and together with the medical specialists who provide medication for things such as ADHD, anxiety, and aggression, we all work together as a team to provide the best outcomes for our Fragile X individuals. All individuals with Fragile X have sensory processing challenges, and this affects their behavior. The behavioral characteristics are hand flapping, hand biting, particularly on this side of the thumb, poor eye contact, increased risk of aggression, sleep disorders, very high baselines of anxiety, and then there are two comorbid things which exist with Fragile X, that is the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and autism spectrum disorder, ASD. Now, no talk about Fragile X would be complete if I didn't mention hyperarousal, because this is something that all individuals with Fragile X experience, and it is an excessive response to sensory stimuli. And it underlies many of the phenotypical behaviors of Fragile X, and unfortunately results in a fight or flight response. And sometimes parents say to me, or caregivers say to me, he's such a peace-loving person, and then suddenly he becomes aggressive and violent, and it's just so out of character. And what that is as a result of hyperarousal. Now, there are various physiological responses to that hyperarousal, which include increased blood to the muscles, increased heart rate, raised blood pressure, more rapid breathing, sweaty palms, pupil dilatation, and the one for me, which is the easiest to see, is the reddening of the face and the ears. The Pyramid of Learning by Williams and Schellenberger proposes that a child's sensory integration is crucial to all their development. So when we talk about sensory integration, it's the way that they take in information, process that information, and then use it to interact with the environment. This forms the basis for all academic learning. If the sensory processing is not working efficiently, it will have a knock-on effect all the way to the top of the pyramid. So if the sensory system is not working well, and there is a type of sensory processing disorder, we tend to see difficulty with the motor responses that that individual can then generate. They then have problems with all types of development. And then we have higher order skills such as speech, language, and problem solving, which are really affected. So we need the individual to feel calm and organized and like their body is in balance for them to be able to learn effectively. The sensory diet is a concept that Patricia Wilbarger developed. In Fragile X, it's something that's been discussed for over 30 years and used with most individuals. It's much like we have a food diet to fuel our daily nutritional needs. This is a sensory diet which feeds the need of the individual on a sensory basis. It helps to keep a calm and organized state, and most importantly, it helps to manage anxiety and hyperarousal. It's something that we as occupational therapists specialize in and can help to provide for the individual. Now, the most important thing to bear in mind when creating a sensory diet is that it's a type of schedule. You've got to make it prescriptive. So providing a long list of sensory input ideas to a parent is not a sensory diet. We need to work out what is going to target specific behaviors or specific needs of the individual, to personalize it to things that are actually of interest to them, that they enjoy doing, or that they will engage in and that they are able to engage in, and then modify that sensory diet as needed. We also need to look at the developmental age and the physical age when developing the sensory diet to ensure that activities are appropriate for them. In order to develop a sensory diet for an individual with Fragile X, we need to look at the neurobiology to guide our clinical reasoning when creating the sensory diet. So hyperarousal is something that they're responding to, and it activates the parasympathetic nervous system. The amygdala detects that there's a threat to the individual, and this activates the behavioral response where we see the hand flapping, the disorganized speech, the running around, the flight or flight response. And there's poor sensory habituation. So that means that when there is a repeated stimulus, like a fan overhead, they can't turn off that fan. They keep hearing that fan over and over and over again. And this, together with many other sensory inputs, causes a bombarding of the sensory system. And this is hyperarousal. There is also no gating, so they can't block out irrelevant or background stimuli. And we need to provide a sensory diet to promote GABA inhibition that reduces sensory nervous system activity in order to restore a sense of calm. This includes promoting sensory recovery and stress recovery to restore a sense of balance. The sensory diet is time-based. It looks at how we fuel our bodies with sensory input throughout the day, from the time we wake up until the time we go to sleep and everything in between. Now, this will vary throughout the day based on the level of alertness the individual needs and what we're actually doing during the day. So you need to pick time-sensitive activities to reduce arousal and anxiety. And in order to do this, we first need to gain a better understanding of the individual. And to do this effectively, we can use tools such as the sensory profile by Winnie Dunn or the sensory processing measure, and then engage in lots of discussion with caregivers and the individual as to what their individual needs and preferences are when they feel hyperaroused and what they feel they need during the day. And this will then guide us to produce that sensory diet. Now, today, I'm not going to actually look at creating a specific sensory diet because every individual is different and it needs to be personalized. I'm going to talk in general because I'm catering to a larger audience, but just to try and give people, particularly the OTs in the audience, an understanding of what the sensory diet would need to incorporate. And then I'm going to leave it up to you to individualize it and fine-tune the specifics. So let's look at a day and what could be happening. When we wake up, a lot of individuals need some sort of alerting or arousing activities. So how are we going to do this? We're going to give them stretching. We're going to give them movement input into their body. Then we're also going to give them some other activities which are again going to be very specific to cater for sensory needs. So if you look at breakfast here, we are jumping on the trampoline. We are having animal walks. We're doing various things and they're very specific. I'm saying a 7-minute HIIT workout or 2 to 3 animal walks, which I'd say do a minimum of 10 of each animal walk, and then something like an electric toothbrush. We've got to also bear in mind that individuals with Fragile X have a very high baseline anxiety, and we need to create sensory diets that are going to try and reduce this baseline of anxiety so that they don't get hyper-aroused and over-anxious very quickly. We can use things like TheraBand activities for this. We need to look at the environment and where they are at various times during the day. At lunchtime, this would be a sensory diet for a child. They're often at school, so they need to use what they have at their disposal. And that is a natural thing to go and play on the playground. We need to ensure, however, that caregivers or teachers are steering them towards playing on the playground and that they're using that lunchtime to gain sensory input, not sitting and reading in the library, which is definitely a calming sensory activity because we often need to feed the sensory system with active activities during those times. So you need to determine how much sensory input your individual needs during the day. Generally, we say individuals need 3 major sensory meals, as we do with the nutritional diet, in the morning, at lunch, and then in the afternoon. But sometimes they might need more than that. And then we have lots of sensory snacks throughout the day. And this again will vary on what the individual's needs are, what anxiety-provoking things are happening during the day, and how much we need to keep these in check with our sensory diets. Now, lots of parents have ordered so much equipment with their NDIS funding, and the sensory diet provides an amazing opportunity to use all this equipment that you've gathered and for your therapist to work out the best ways in which to use this equipment that you have. So, for instance, a swing. A swing can be used for arousal by fast, jerky, erratic swinging, or it can be used for calming, slow, gentle, rhythmic swinging. It can also be used as part of the proactive sensory diet, or it can be used as part of a reactive sensory diet, which I'll discuss shortly. So for the reactive sensory diet, it may be that the individual is so hyper-aroused by a certain stimulus that they can't function. We suggest they go into that swing, and just give them lots of calming, gentle input. So think of what equipment you have at your disposal. Think of indoor equipment, outdoor equipment, what's preferable in the morning, what's preferable at night. And also don't forget the value of using nature. We all know that nature is calming, nature is soothing. Things like walking a dog, going on a general walk with other family members, scootering, riding a bike, playing outside with the ball. I'm not suggesting that we would do that on the East Coast today in this freezing weather we're having at the moment, but other places in the country might have warmer, much more pleasant weather to be outside. For the reactive or responsive sensory diet, we need to look at what the immediate challenge is. So if it is something like going to the car, and transitions are always a challenge for individuals with Fragile X, it is how do we manage that sensory challenge and what sensory input can we give to counteract it? I'm going to give you an example of a young man who comes for therapy. He is 13 years old and he has extreme difficulty with challenges. We've tried social stories, we've tried lots of different options. And last week I decided we were going to try sensory input to manage the challenge and see how that worked. So we used something as well we call the 5-finger approach. So I said to him, stop. Before we go to the car, we need to look at what we need to do. So the first thing with the 5-finger approach is we need to stop, we need to take a deep breath. And he has been very well trained in deep breathing, so he did that beautifully. I said, what do we need to do? We need to go to the car. How are we going to do this? And I gave him a very prescriptive recipe of deep pressure input. I said to him, we are going to walk out of the therapy room and we are going to march like soldiers all the way to the car. You're going to open the car door, get inside the door. And then he calls me Bev Kadish because he attends speech with my colleague Bev Sher. I said, and Bev Kadish is going to close the door. Let's do it. And it was amazing to see that this was the most successful transition he has ever had. He got up, he did exactly what was required, and that sensory input had such a calming effect on him that I'm now going to take it from his responsive sensory diet, and we've put it into his everyday sensory diet, that he is going to use that transition strategy when he has to go to school, when he returns from school, when he goes to any therapies, when he returns from therapies. In our sensory diet, we need lots of whole movement body activities. And one of my favorite is crash and burn, where you literally run and crash into crash mat, giving that whole body sensory input. I think we also need to be very specific with these things. So often I'll say we need to do 5 crashes and burns or 10 crashes and burns, whatever the individual needs. I often say to them afterwards, and sometimes I start my session with this, particularly if I can see they're a bit dysregulated after a transition, with, do we need more crashes or have you had enough? And my clients actually become quite good at telling me what they need. And this is how we modify the sensory diet. Certain occasions, they come in very dysregulated, and we obviously need to do more. But we generally have a number that we find works, and we make that the specific number of crashes they're going to include in the sensory diet. It's also important with the Fragile X individual that you actually do things with them. Don't tell them what to do, because a lot of them become bombarded with too much auditory input. And again, that raises anxiety level and leads to hyperarousal. So show them what you want them to do and do it with them. So initially, this might involve holding their hand, running and crashing onto the crash mats with them. Then as they develop a better idea of what's required, holding their hand and almost throwing them onto the crash mat so that they're completing it using our backwards training strategy. And then once they've practiced that a few times, actually being able to do it on their own. Jumping on a trampoline is one of the best sensory input activities for arousal and calming. And again, be specific, say 3 to 5 minutes, choose an indoor trampoline, an outdoor trampoline, whatever you have at your disposal. For the children with Fragile X, animal walks are another favorite, where we actually have to work out what animal walks are they capable of, bearing in mind there is often low muscle tone and poor motor planning. And then I like to give options and say, do 3 animal walks, 10 paces of each, and they can choose from those animal walks which ones they'd like to do. If you have access to a swing or a hammock, that's wonderful. And as I said before, these can provide both excitatory, relaxation types of input. A swivel desk chair is something else that can be used for a similar purpose. Sports and going to the park should be included in the sensory diet. So if your individual is going on a particular day to something like equine therapy, all abilities basketball, or just going to the park after school, put these movement opportunities in as part of your sensory diet, because that's what they really are. They're ways of gaining sensory input, and you don't have to think of something else to do at that time, because that is what they would normally be doing. Dancing and whole body movements to songs are amazing. They provide lots of good quality rhythmic movement. There are so many different ways to do this. So you can sing to your individual, and this is a response, a proactive strategy again, that you can sing in a very gentle voice while they're doing movement. Songs like Row, Row, Row Your Boat, Ring Around the Rosie, the Hokey Pokey song. Any kind of dance routine is good. And there are lots of movement videos on YouTube. And we all know how our Fragile X individuals love YouTube. And by watching this as a modeling medium, they are brilliant imitators. They can then copy these things and dance with them. A bit of inversion is always calming to the nervous system. So upside down on a trapeze, something like wheelbarrow walks, or lying forward over a Swiss ball or a peanut ball. And that's a great calming strategy at the end of the day when we're trying to calm the nervous system down as part of our sleep routine. A lot of the Fragile X kids love lying prone on the couch and just leaning onto the floor to do things like reading a book, doing a puzzle. These are all calming sensory activities which will help to calm down their sensory system because they cannot modulate well, meaning that they can't go from a more active state to a calmer state, and they actually need specific guided activities to calm down that nervous system. As I mentioned before, that marching that we did to the car was a brilliant sensory input activity, and just lots of deep pressure there and lots of proprioception. Those are calming and organizing in nature, and think of them as being centering and grounding. So deep pressure or proprioceptive input is one of the main components of the sensory diet. And this is where the muscles and joints are getting lots of feedback from the sensory activity that they are engaging in. So things like wall pushes, chair push-ups. I'm going to ask everybody now to think about doing a self-hug where you take your arms and you actually give yourself a hug. So let's all do a self-hug now with lots of deep pressure. And we can do a few self-hugs, or we can do something like 10 self-hugs. And this may come after intense sensory input on a playground, like when a child goes back to the classroom and they need to center and calm themselves and get more grounded. Something like a self-hug is beneficial. Big bear hugs from parents, and we've seen so many Fragile X individuals going up to their parents and sitting in their laps and demanding these hugs because that is what makes them feel calm and organized. I'm going to ask you to also try this one. We can call this praying hands, yoga hands, pressing hands. And if we can just do 10 pushes with lots of pressure, just feel how calming that is for you. Another one could be pulling a rope that's attached to a door. And again, be specific, not just pull the rope, but pull the rope 20 times. Or have a tug of war and see who can win 5 times with a sibling after school is another great activity. Heavy work also comes from pushing and pulling and carrying. So think of things like watering the garden, carrying in the groceries, organizing tin cans, sand play, filling up buckets of sand, water play, filling different containers with water. So we can have different types of sensory activities where the individual who has Fragile X is administering that deep pressure or proprioception to themselves, or where they're getting it from an external source, like the big bear hug, or just pressing down on shoulders. Just remember, we want nice, firm, even pressure, and that the rhythmic quality of this is important. Now, a Swiss ball can also be used in various ways to provide sensory input. And I'm going to give you some examples of using a Swiss ball. I have a 23-year-old young lady with Fragile X who came to me. Well, she still does come to me. And she has very low arousal in the morning. So for her to get up and going in the morning is the biggest challenge of the day. We started doing activities using a Swiss ball because when I mentioned movement, she was like, I don't do exercise, I don't do movement, I don't want to know anything. When I mentioned a Swiss ball, she said, yeah, I've got one of those. Not that she was using it at the time, but we started off with her just sitting on it and bouncing up and down 20 times seated on the Swiss ball. She then takes the Swiss ball and rolls it up the wall as high as she can and back down again. And she does that 10 times. And then she takes the Swiss ball and bounces it on the floor, pushing it down with her hands another 10 times. So those are great arousal activities. And her mum has reported that for her to then get dressed, have breakfast, brush her teeth, brush her hair, and get ready for TAFE has been a totally different experience, because now her body is alert, aroused, and ready to actually partake in those activities. She then has many other sensory input activities, much less intense in nature, to use during the day. And she can use all of these activities wherever she is. So she uses things like a piece of resistance band, therapy, she has crunchy snacks and things like that throughout her day. And then in the evenings again, we get out that therapy ball. And I don't know if you can see the picture at the bottom where somebody is being made into a pizza, where you actually roll the therapy ball over them. So her mum does that for her. And the other thing she likes to do is just lie draped over the therapy ball in prone and read a book. And she finds that really calming, and that helps to get her into sleep mode, as she calls it. There's so many other tools and ways of getting deep pressure input. We can use things like weighted backpacks. And we discussed last week in the presentation the value of having a backpack with all the different sensory tools in it. Sometimes putting a heavy water bottle in can just add that extra deep pressure, which is calming. Compression vests are great with the jet-proof clothing, and then also the weighted vest you can see here. Body socks are also calming. And then you can see a weighted lap bag. And then we have my favorite, Percy the platypus, on the right-hand side of your slide over there. He is a weighted platypus, and he has a range of different friends, all of whom weigh different amounts. There's a weighted snake, a turtle, a monkey, and lots of others. And you just need to make sure, again, it's got to be individualized, that that weight is appropriate for the person for whom you're prescribing it. At night, compression sheets or weighted blanket calming and often help maintain a sleep-like state. So that is another sensory input that can be very valuable. The TheraPressure technique is something that OTs need to be trained in order to teach their clients how to use it. It's really important that this technique be taught properly. And I found there's so many families who have those white TheraPressure brushes who don't know how to use them. So this again can be part of our proactive sensory diet, or when the individual with Fragile X is in a state of hyperarousal, literally walking up to them or holding on to them and just start applying deep pressure using that TheraPressure protocol. And I've seen them literally melt in my hands. It is such a powerful tool for calming and restoring that state of homeostasis and balance. Now, there are lots of other things we can use for regulation, such as fidget toys. These give us lots of pressure through the hands. We can use resistance bands and either prescribe a set of resistance bands activities or just use resistance bands pulling. We have a lot of kids that we see who have that resistance band wrapped around their chairs, and they use that to kick against to help them regulate and just stay calm in the classroom. Doodling is fantastic because it is repetitive, it is rhythmic, and that can help maintain regulation. Then moving sit cushions, as you can see on the right of your slide, provide that movement input that they need just to stay calm and seated. Lots of fidget toys, and there are so many different suppliers of fidget toys. Now, you don't need to always go to one of the expensive therapy tool suppliers to get these fidget toys. Kmart also have lots of different fidget toys, and things like the puppets, which are really in fashion now, are available from places like $2 shops. So just look around, think what you have available in your home. Things like those fidget cubes, I've also seen at $2 shops. So just see what works for your individual and think what's relevant for their age and stage. I am going to advise against fidget spinners if your individual tends to become aggressive, because those fidget spinners, I have known them to be used as weapons, And I've had a poor sibling who got a cut on their forehead and had to go for stitches when my young man with Fragile X became totally hyper aroused, and brother was the nearest thing and he threw the fidget spinner at him. Also providing things like swivel chairs, and Swiss balls have been used quite a lot in workplace environments for adults with Fragile X. We can then think of things like oral input, where we can use activities like blowing. So blowing bubbles, blowing cotton wool balls, and there's lots of commercially available games like Blow Soccer, which provide lots of calming input, good to use at night when we're trying to calm that sensory system down. The sensory snacks, I think most OTs will know to use in the sensory diet, things like apples, cucumbers, celery, crunchy crackers, nuts, anything that provides crunch. And we often encourage parents to include these in lunch boxes for snack time at recess at school. Something cold in the mouth can be calming, like a block of ice, sucking on an icy pole. Another good thing to bear in mind is if your individual with Fragile X becomes hyper aroused from too much swinging or too erratic a movement, just give them a block of ice and get them to suck on that. It is great for restoring that state of calm and organization. Sustained chewing is very, very calming. So things like jerky, biltong, Laffy Taffy, toffees. We use a reactive strategy in our sensory diets at the Fragile X Multidisciplinary Clinic. So when individuals come to meet the team, they are often quite anxious. They've often traveled from far, so they are unfamiliar with the territory they are in, and they can be quite aroused. We give them a large piece of Hubba Bubba before we even start talking to them. And this just gives them deep pressure, and it's amazing the calming effect it can have. We've even got some schools on board to allow the chewing of bubblegum in the classroom if the therapist can write a strong enough motivation as to why the child needs it and that it's being used as a therapeutic medium to calm the nervous system. I also love those Camelback water bottles, which have a thick straw and provide resistance, so sucking through that is calming. And then encouraging them to drink thick liquids through a straw. Things like jelly, yogurt, applesauce, or custard can also be very calming. In the sensory diet, we also tend to use a lot of breath work. And I find that breath work is often a reactive strategy, and we need to teach our individuals with Fragile X how to actually breathe. So we're going to do one of the breathing strategies here. On the left, I hope you can all see the breathing hand. So if everybody can put up their hand, and we're just going to do slowly breathing in and breathing out. In and out. In and out. In and out. In and out. And you probably feel a little bit of a sense of calm just by doing that. So when they're hyper aroused, that's often a great thing to do. I think it's very valuable to print out the breathing cards, because when they're in a state of hyper arousal or very anxious, they often cannot listen to what you're telling them. So you need to just be able to give them something visual that they can look at and then act upon. Another one is the box breathing, where we breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. Here I have the star breathing card, and on the next slide, there are another two examples, the hexagon breathing and the figure 8 breathing. There are so many different options. Just work out what works for your individual, and you may need to teach them how to breathe in and how to breathe out, actually using physical prompts. So to breathe out, blowing out a candle, to breathe in, sucking through a straw, and just practice those alternating movements for them to gain an idea of what is actually required with the deep breathing. If they have that emergency backpack with all their sensory tools in, put your breathing cards in. Those are always very useful for them to have and feel good again before moving on. The next thing we can do is using the auditory system. Music is often very organizing. We use things like therapeutic listening, and you will need an OT who is trained in this area, who can prescribe the correct types of music. It's often a proactive strategy, but again, we can use something like quick shifts, which is a reactive strategy, which can quickly shift someone in a state of hyperarousal to a much calmer state in a matter of minutes. The regulation series is great for calming with Fragile X. Using your own voice, you always have your voice with you. You can sing. People who've been to me for therapy know that sometimes I sing to their children. I don't have a great voice, but despite that, it has amazing therapeutic effect. And then we have co-regulation coming into play, where they see my calm, regulated state, and the individual with Fragile X mimics that state. Using sensory defenders is beneficial. With a sensory diet, we always think of putting in input. Sometimes we need to think of removing sensory input or blocking it out by using things such as the sensory defenders. Having a calming, soothing place to go is also very important. And this is when the individual starts to feel hyper-aroused. They can go somewhere that is confined, comforting, and has some comfort items for them and can help them to re-regulate. And over here, you see a picture of a tent. It doesn't have to be a tent. Sometimes there's a box in a classroom. Sometimes it's a corner. Sometimes it's a small room. Sometimes it's just a specific place in your house, on a bunk bed, anywhere that your individual finds to be calming, soothing, and hopefully can block out some of those sensory inputs that they are finding so overwhelming. Whether you have fidget toys in there, ear defenders, therapati, bean bags to lie in, a pod, whatever will be beneficial to your individual with Fragile X. We just want them to be able to go in there, feel calm, and when they are ready, to re-emerge and be able to continue on. We need to bear in mind the disposition of Fragile X individuals when we deliver the sensory diet, because this is going to affect how we deliver the sensory diet. So they are very friendly and social, and they want to go out and they want to be with people and they want to engage. The difficulty with this comes is that they sometimes go into sensory overload at these times. And we just need to bear in mind that they want to be involved, but we need to help them to reduce their anxiety and their hyperarousal. As I mentioned previously, they have amazing imitation skills. So by playing YouTube videos over and over for them, again, with all those different movements, dancing type strategies we want them to engage in, that is how they are going to learn those things. They have strong visual and long-term memories. So creating a visual schedule and including this as part of your daily schedule is also important. And then I like to give choices so that it is prescriptive, but within the prescription, there are choices for them to feel, particularly the adults, that they are actually empowered and they are making choices and not being bossed around, as one of my adults told me. His mum was bossing him around when she was getting him to do the activities. And I said to him, well, you look at the schedule and you decide which activities you would like to do. And he is now feeling much happier about engaging in those sensory input activities. Also, don't stop when the sensory diet is working. I think parents tend to forget the value of these sensory inputs. And as soon as the individual is feeling calm and organized, and this also sometimes happens in these residential facilities where the individual in the house is calm and organized, is not creating chaos anymore, is much more relaxed and does not get hyper aroused as easily. And they actually stop using the strategies. And then they come to me and they say, I don't know what happened, but suddenly he's become violent again. He's aggressive. He's not coping. What do we need to do? And the first question I ask is, are you still doing the sensory diet? And they say, no, it was working. He was great. We stopped using it. So just keep using that sensory diet, keep modifying it. It's not something that's static. It's something that can always be added to, and something that can also be modified as the individual gets older and their needs change, their situations change, and keep it based on what the daily activity is. So During the school term, it's going to be very different from school holidays. Family weekends are going to be different to when they are in residential accommodation. So just think of all these things when you're designing the sensory diet. Check in, just help them to feel calm and organized, and you will get the most out of your individual with Fragile X. Thank you. And now on to the questions.
How would you encourage independence with a sensory diet for a teenage individual who finds it challenging to remember and complete the activities without becoming distracted?
So I think we need to ensure that the individual is interested in those activities, that they are meaningful to them, and that they actually understand why they are doing these activities, especially if they have the cognitive abilities for that. We also don't want activities to be too long. So if the activities can sort of be shorter in duration, and if they are whole body activities, they provide a lot more sensory input than sort of using fidget toys and things like that. And always use visuals. So whether it be on a visual schedule of sensory input activities, or in Fragile X, we like using task schedules as well. So even for simple things like washing hands, some of us individuals get distracted doing that. So actually giving them a schedule of turning on the tap, putting your hands under the tap, putting soap on, rinsing your hands, turning off the tap, drying your hands. Those are the kinds of task schedules that you can incorporate in your sensory diet as well. So when I'm doing therapy, it might sound ridiculous, but I often have 3 different sets of visuals operating at one time. So one is the visual schedule of what we're going to do in that activity session. Then we have a breakdown of different activities. And then I might have a sensory schedule as well, showing them what sensory activities we do. And there are lots of individual activity schedules, which can just be pulled up as we get to that particular activity. It's great if you can laminate these and just use them over and over again on a daily basis as they need them.
Lovely, thank you. Kerry has asked a couple of questions. The first one is, do you have any favourite quick shifts? And the next question is, are the Sensory Defenders any particular brand?
Okay, so in terms of quick shifts, you need to see what your individual needs and just use the quick shift best suited to them. I wouldn't say I have a favourite. I find it really varies on what the difficulty is for them, and then also what their age and stage is, and also their cognitive level. Some of them respond better to sort of the more intense quick shifts, and others sort of the more basal quick shifts. And then in terms of the Sensory Defenders, we have found it particularly difficult to get ones for adults. There are some, and I am just going to have to look. I think they're from Special Needs Resources, the ones that we use for adults. The ones that we use for the kids are the ones from Sensory Tools, because they cover the whole ear, so they block out the most sensory input. Just be aware when you use those Sensory Defenders, we don't want them used all the time in the classroom, because Fragile X individuals are so sociable and do want to participate, and we want to encourage that participation. So to just use them during the very busy, overwhelming times in the classroom, but if the teacher's giving instructions or it's quiet working time, we'd like them to rather be part of the class than having those Sensory Defenders on. And then definitely to have them in their withdrawal area, because those are times that they really need them to sort of just move away from any auditory stimuli. So if you use the earphones that are prescribed with the therapeutic listening, it is more effective. The thing to bear in mind is we want the intensity of that input. So if you're not using earphones, you're getting it to be diluted with whatever background noises there are. And we know that individuals with Fragile X have difficulty habituating to background noises. So far more effective to use it with the earphones than without. But I'm going to say sometimes you do whatever you have at your disposal. And if they have to put the mobile phone to their ear, you do that if that is all that you have available at that time. It's still going to be of some value, but it's preferred to use the headphones if you have them available.
And Kerry's also asked, can you run through the 5-finger method?
So the 5-finger method is something to use when they're starting to become anxious, when they're not coping with the situation, or when they can't plan what they need to do. So the first thing to do is put up your hand. So I'm going to get everybody to practice this. So everybody, not put up your hand icon, but put up your physical hand. So the first thing to say is stop and touch the first finger. It's also proprioceptive input by touching the fingers. Then we say, take a deep breath. So take your deep breath. The next thing is, what do you need to do? And often when they're hyper-aroused, they can't tell me what they need to do. But I can say to them, you need to sit down on your chair. The next step is the therapist or the parent or the carer or the support worker is going to say, how are we going to do this? And this is where you have to strategize. Remember, they're in a state of hyperarousal. They're very anxious. They're not thinking clearly, and they're not going to be able to provide you with strategies. So you need to strategize for them. How are you going to do this? I'm going to walk to my chair. I'm going to pull it out. I'm going to put my bottom on the chair, and I'm going to sit down. Okay, let's do it. And then you guide them towards doing it. That can be really effective if there's a task to be done, if there's a transition to be made, if there's an instruction to be followed, and also if they've lost track of where they're going and what they're doing. Sometimes you need to say to them, like those ADHD ones, stop, and then just guide them on the path of what they actually need to be doing again.
Wonderful. Any more questions or comments? Oh, as a new graduate, this webinar has been very helpful. So thank you, guys. That's from Kaya. Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Thank you, Kaya. And I think this is something that we as occupational therapists encounter all the time. We don't get taught about things like sensory diet in great detail in our undergraduate training. So these poor new grads, well, they're OTs. They're supposed to know everything about sensory diets and things, but they often don't. So don't be shy. I'm very happy for you to email me at some stage. Just ask questions and I can just help guide you, because I've seen the value of sensory diets for all our individuals with Fragile X, as well as others on the spectrum, or anybody for that matter with sensory processing difficulties. I also have some parents who have started using parts of their children's sensory diets because they've realized the value to themselves as well of using those calming strategies. So just think about that. And I'm just also going to mention to all the educators who are online tonight, I've done a podcast just about specific strategies for Fragile X in the classroom. It was done in conjunction with the Victorian Department of Education. And it's about an hour long, but it just gives a lot of Fragile X specific strategies like that 5-finger approach, which you can use in your classrooms and which are very valuable for you.
And Helen's asked, any tips for teaching young children to take deep breaths, currently using imitation to blow bubbles or wand?
Those are two brilliant things. Again, imitation is one of their strengths. We sometimes use smell the flowers, smell the perfume, but just check on their sensory sensitivities, because sometimes they don't tolerate these things so well. So sometimes it's, and I often have the two things side by side. Smell the flowers, now blow out the candle. Smell the flowers, blow out the candle. And we've got to use that imitation, sitting opposite them, doing it with them. And often teach each one in isolation. So first teach the smell the flowers skill, then teach the blow out the candle skill, and then combine the two. And that's quite an effective way of teaching deep breathing. Also, if you can actually get them to feel what their body's doing, so just lying supine on a mat or a mattress or something, and get them to put their hands on their body. And once they get that concept of breathing in, to make the breath deeper, get them to feel that their tummy's sort of getting bigger and bigger, or their chest, and then breathing out that it's coming back in again. Jen Jareb, I didn't actually mention, I don't use her stuff much anymore. She's an OT who passed away sadly last year, who made an enormous contribution to sensory fragile, not the sensory world really. And the reason I don't use her stuff much anymore is mine's all on CDs and my CD player broke, which is just showing how long I've had it. But she has amazing stuff, and that is all available from Sensory Tools. And a lot of those teach breathing, regulation. They're very rhythmic, beautiful, beautiful music to use.
This song of Genevieve, they are on Spotify.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. I've never thought to look there. You are a lifesaver. Thank you, Sarah.
No worries.
So I've learned something too on this webinar tonight. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Lots of wonderful comments from people. Bev, thanking you for an amazing and informative presentation. It was so helpful.
I think I just want to thank you all for coming to the presentation, and just to say that I hope you can use these tools to enrich and improve the lives of some individuals with Fragile X, and that you can incorporate some of these strategies in your treatment.
We might just mention the research study you can see on your screen there. The Fragile X Association is looking for some feedback on our online support programs, including the webinars and online Zoom peer support groups, as well as the Fragile X Association discussion groups. So the University of Melbourne will be facilitating interviews from people who've had involvement in any of these programs, and provide feedback anonymously to help us improve or change the format to better support the Fragile X community. Interviews will be conducted by phone or Zoom with a researcher from the university and will last around 30 minutes. An invitation to participate in the study will be sent to everyone who is registered for tonight's webinar, and also promoted via the Fragile X Association website and social media channels. We will really welcome your feedback. Thank you. And we did mention Dr. Jonathan Cohen before, and I might just add that our next webinar will be on Thursday, the 23rd of June, focusing on adults with Fragile X health considerations with Dr. Jonathan Cohen.